The behavioral approach to teaching, direct instruction. For behavioral psychologists, learning means acquiring new behaviors, and new behaviors are learned because of the role that external stimuli play. Thus, a behavioral approach to teaching involves arranging and implementing those conditions that make it highly likely that a desired desired response will occur in the presence of particular stimulus, such as reading a sentence fluently, accurately using the correct mathematical operations when faced with a long division problem, and giving the correct English translation of a paragraph written in Spanish. Perhaps the most popular approach to teaching that is based on behavioral theory is direct instruction. The nature of direct instruction. The underlying philosophy of direct instruction, sometimes called explicit teaching, is that if the student has not learned, the teacher has not effectively taught. This approach calls for the teacher to keep students consistently engaged in learning basic skills and knowledge through the design of effective lessons, corrective feedback, and opportunities for practice. It is most frequently used in the teaching of basic skills. For example, reading, mathematical computation, writing, and subject matter. For example, science, social studies, foreign language, vocabulary, in the primary and elementary grades. It is also used to teach remedial classes at the middle school and high school levels. It is felt to be most useful for young learners, slow learners, and all learners when the material is new and difficult to grasp at first. Although there are several variations of direct instruction, the following represents a synthesis of description offered by Bruce Joyce and Marcia Wheel, Barak Rosenshine, and Carla Meister, Bruce Larson and Timothy Kuiper, and Jennifer Goki. The main characteristics of direct instruction include focusing almost all classroom activity on learning basic academic knowledge and skills. Effective in social objectives, such as improved social self-esteem and learning to get along with others, are either de-emphasized or ignored. Having the teacher make all instructional decisions, such as how much material will be covered at one time, whether students work individually or in groups, and whether students work on mathematics during the morning and social studies during the afternoon. Keeping students working productively toward learning new academic knowledge and skills, usually called being on task as much as possible. Designing all lessons to include demonstration, practice, and corrective feedback. Maintaining a positive classroom climate by emphasizing positive reinforcement and avoiding the use of aversive consequences. The goal of direct instruction is to have students master basic skills and content before moving on to more advanced levels. Advocates of this method believe that students who mislearn information require substantially more time and effort to relearn concepts than would have been the case had they learned them correctly in the first place. For obvious reasons, direct instruction is a highly structured approach to teaching and is often referred to as teacher-directed or teacher-led instruction. The components of direct instruction. Joyce and Wheel identify 5 general components or phases that make up direct instruction: orientation, presentation, structured practice, guided practice, and independent practice. These components are not derived just from theory. They reflect the techniques that effective teachers at all grade levels have been observed to use. Orientation. During the orientation phase, the teacher provides an overview of the lesson, explains why students need to learn the upcoming material, relates the new subject either to material learned during earlier lessons or to their life experience, and tells students what they will need to do to learn the material and what level of performance they will be expected to exhibit. Presentation. The presentation phase initially involves explaining, illustrating, and demonstrating the new material. As with all other forms of instruction based on operant conditioning, the lesson is broken down into small, easy-to-learn steps to ensure mastery of each step in the lesson sequence. Numerous examples of new concepts and skills are provided, and consistent with social learning theory, the teacher demonstrates the kind of response students should strive for. such as a particular pronunciation of foreign vocabulary, reading of a poem or story, the steps of mathematical operations, or how to analyze a novel for theme, character, or setting. To assist comprehension, and where appropriate, material can be presented pictorially, as slides, videotapes, or a computer, or graphically, as a concept maps, a timeline, or a table form. At the first sign of difficulty, the teacher gives additional explanations. The last step of the presentation phase is to evaluate students' understanding. This is typically done through a question and answer session in which the questions call for specific answers, as well as explanations of how students formulated their answers. Some sort of system is used to ensure that all students receive an equal opportunity to respond to questions. Throughout the lesson, efforts are made to stay on task and avoid non-productive digressions. Structured, guided, and independent practice. The last three phases of the direct instruction model all focus on practice, although with successively lower levels of assistance. Joyce and Weil refer to these three phases as structured practice, guided practice, and independent practice. Because the level of teacher assistance is gradually withdrawn, you may recognize this progression as an attempt to apply the behavioral principle of shaping. You may also recognize it as the constructivist principle of scaffolding. Structured practice involves the greatest degree of teacher assistance. The teacher leads the entire class through each step in a problem or lesson as to minimize incorrect responses. Visual displays such as overhead transparencies are commonly used during structured practice as a way to illustrate and help students recall the components of a lesson. As the students respond, the teacher reinforces correct responses and corrects errors. During guided practice, students work at their own desks on problems of the type explained and demonstrated by the teacher. The teacher circulates among the students, checking for and correcting any errors. When students can correctly solve at least 85% of the problems given to them during guided practice, they are deemed ready for independent practice. At this point, students are encouraged to practice on their own either in class or at home. Although the teacher continues to assess the accuracy of the student's work and provide feedback, it is done on a more delayed basis. Getting the most out of practice. Joyce and Weil offer the following suggestions to help make practice effective. Shape student learning by systematically moving students from structured practice to guided practice to independent practice. Schedule several relatively short but intense practice sessions, which typically produce more learning than fewer but longer sessions. For primary grade students, several 5 to 10 minute sessions scattered over the day are likely to produce better results than the 1 or 2 30 to 40 minute sessions that middle school or high school students can tolerate. Carefully monitor the accuracy of students' responses during structured practice to reinforce correct responses and correct unacceptable responses. The reason for this suggestion comes straight out of operant conditioning research. As you may recall from the chapter on behavioral learning theory, Skinner found that new behaviors are learned most rapidly when correct responses are immediately reinforced and incorrect responses are eliminated. When a learner makes incorrect responses that are not corrected, they become part of the learner's behavioral repertoire and impede the progress of subsequent learning. To ensure the higher degree of success that results in mastery of basic skills, students should not engage in independent practice until they can respond correctly to at least 85% of the examples presented to them during structured and guided practice. Practice sessions for any lesson should be spread over several months. The habit of some teachers of not reviewing a topic once that part of the curriculum has been covered usually leads to a lower quality of learning. Once again, distributed practice produces better learning than massed practice. Space practice sessions close together during structured practice, but further and further apart for guided practice and independent practice. Effectiveness of direct instruction. Studies of direct instruction that have been done in urban schools that enroll high percentages of minority students and students of low socioeconomic status have produced moderately positive results. For example, a version of direct instruction called the big accommodation model, because instruction is organized around big ideas, was implemented in a California middle school that served high poverty neighborhoods. After 1 year, the percentage of 7th and 8th grade students who were reading at the 5th grade level or lower declined, whereas the percentage reading at the 6th and 7th grade or higher levels increased. Similar results were obtained for math achievement scores. In percentage terms, the most dramatic increase occurred among English language learners. Before the program was implemented, only 10% scored at grade level, 7th grade or above, on reading and math tests. 1 year later, that figure rose to about 36%. The largest gains in grade equivalent scores were made by white, American Indian, and Latino students. Using technology to support behavioral approaches to instruction. The computer-based approach to instruction that uses behavioral learning principles emphasizes specific performance objectives, breaking down learning into small steps, shaping student success, using immediate feedback and consistent rewards, and predefining assessment techniques. Learning is viewed much like an industrial assembly line. Information is transferred efficiently from a computer program to a waiting student. Most of the drill and practice, computer-assisted instruction tools, and integrating learning systems mentioned in the chapter on behavioral learning theory fit within this framework, as would multimedia technology if used simply to embellish a lecture with new pictures or sounds. Although this approach to the use of technology in instruction may be perceived as rote, boring, and dehumanizing, it can prove valuable if you are interested in accurate and efficient learning of basic skills and facts. The cognitive approach to teaching, facilitating meaningful and self-regulated learning. The focus of cognitive learning theories is the mind and how it works. Hence, cognitive psychologists are primarily interested in studying those mental processes that expand our knowledge base and allow us to understand and respond to the world differently. In this section, we will lay out two approaches to instruction that are based on different forms of cognitive theory: information processing, social cognitive, and constructivism. The information processing social cognitive approach to teaching involves implementing those conditions that help students effectively transfer information from the outside, a text or lecture, for example, to the inside, the mind, whereas the constructivist approach focuses on providing students opportunities to create their own meaningful view of reality. The nature and elements of an information processing social cognitive approach. As we noted previously in the book, information processing and social cognitive theories both focus on how human beings interpret and mentally manipulate the information they encounter. Research shows that for information to be meaningfully learned, it must be attended to, its critical features must be noticed, it must be coded in an organized and meaningful way so as to make its retrieval more likely, and strategies must be devised that allow this process to occur for a variety of tasks and in a variety of circumstances. The approach to teaching that flows from these theories has two main parts. First, design lessons and gear teaching behaviors to capitalize on what is known about the learning process. As you will see, this part of the information processing social cognitive approach has some elements in common with the behavioral approach that we just covered. Both approaches direct you to structure the classroom environment in a certain way and to use some of the same tactics to improve the effectiveness and efficacy or efficiency of learning. Second, and this is what makes the information processing social cognitive approach unique, make students aware of how they learn and how they can use those processes to improve their classroom performance. Following are several suggestions for helping students become more effective processors of classroom instruction. Communicate clear goals and objectives. The first question that students ask themselves when they take a new course, encounter a new topic, or are asked to learn a new skill is, why do I have to learn this? We suspect you've asked yourself this question many times and not gotten a satisfactory answer. So at the beginning of each lesson, tell students what you want them to accomplish, why you think it's important that they learn this knowledge or skill, and how you're going to assess their learning. If you intend to use paper and pencil tests, tell them what content areas will be covered, what kinds of questions you will include, in terms of whatever taxonomies you use to generate your objectives, and how many of each type of question will be on the test. Without this information, students will be unable to formulate a rational approach to learning and studying because they will be forced to guess about these features. They may, for example, take your general directive to learn this material for the test as a cue to memorize when you expected them to be able to explain ideas in their own words. If you intend to use performance measures, tell students the conditions under which they will have to perform and what criteria you will use to judge their performance. Use attention-getting devices. Information processing social cognitive theory holds that material not attended to is not processed, and material that is not processed is not stored in memory. Consequently, you should use, but not overuse, a variety of attention-getting devices. The suggestion we just made to explain the purpose of a lesson, what students will be held accountable for learning, and how student learning will be assessed will likely capture the attention of some students. But once you are in a lesson, you may need to gain and maintain students' attention repeatedly. The suggestions for teaching section, helping your students become efficient information processors, in Chapter 8, Information Processing Theory, mentioned a few devices for capturing students' attention. Here are several more. Orally emphasize certain words or phrases by raising or lowering your voice. Use dramatic gestures. Underline key words and phrases that you write on a chalkboard or whiteboard. When discussing the work of important people, whether in science, math, social studies, or history, dress up to look like the person and speak as you think the person might have spoken. One approach to teaching that describes how to get students' attention by embedding lessons in unusual but meaningful contexts, and that is worth examining, is called outrageous instruction by its creator, Paugrow. Emphasize organization and meaningfulness. Research studies have repeatedly found that students learn and recall more information when it is presented in an organized format and a meaningful context. Information is organized when the components that make it up are linked together in some rational way. If you teach high school physics, you can organize material according to major theories or basic principles or key discoveries, depending on your purpose. For history, you can identify main ideas and their supporting details, or describe events as a chain of causes and effects. Just about any form of organization would be better than having students memorize names, dates, places, and other facts as isolated fragments of information. A popular method for organizing and spatially representing the relationships among a set of ideas is concept mapping, as we noted earlier in Chapter 9, Social Cognitive Theory. This technique involves specifying the ideas that make up a topic and indicating with lines how they relate to one another. Figure 13.2 is a particularly interesting example of both organized knowledge and a constructivist view of learning. We'll take a further look at this later angle when we discuss constructivist approaches. So here's your map. As we pointed out in Chapters 8 and 9, meaningful learning results in richer and more stable memory representations and occurs more readily when information can be related to familiar ideas and experiences. Several techniques are known to facilitate meaningful learning. Using some form of overview or introduction that provides a meaningful context for new material. Using concrete examples and analogies to illustrate otherwise abstract ideas. Using visually based methods of representing information, such as maps, graphs, and three-dimensional models, stressing practical applications and relationships to other subjects. You may recall from a previous chapter that this tactic is used to help adolescent girls remain interested in science. Present information in learnable amounts and over realistic time periods. When students struggle to master the information they are expected to learn, the problem sometimes arises simply from an excess of information being presented to them at once. That is, from too great an external demand. At other times, the student's working short-term memory is strained because of the nature of the task itself. For instance, if the task has several components that all have to be monitored, by taking the nature of the task into consideration, you can judge how much information to expect your students to learn in a given time. For tasks in which a set of discrete elements must be learned in a one-at-a-time fashion, such as learning foreign language vocabulary or the symbols of chemical elements, the demand on working memory and comprehension is low because the elements are independent. Learning the meaning of one word or symbol has no effect on learning of any of the others. As long as the external load on working memory is kept reasonable by limiting the number of words or symbols that students have to learn at any time, learning problems should be minimal. Other tasks make greater demands on working memory because their elements interact. Learning to produce and recognize grammatically correct utterances. The cat climbed up the tree versus the tree the climbed cat up the. Is a task that places a higher demand on working memory because the meaning of all the words must be considered simultaneously to determine if the sentence makes sense. For such tasks, keeping the amount of information that students are required to learn at a low level is critically important because it leaves the student with sufficient working memory to engage in a schema construction. One instructional recommendation that flows from this analysis is the same as one of the recommendations for direct instruction. Break lessons into small, manageable parts and don't introduce new topics until you have evidence that students have learned the presented material. A second recommendation is to build into lessons opportunities for students to write about, discuss, and use the ideas they are learning. By monitoring the accuracy of their responses, you will also have the information you need to judge whether it is time to introduce new ideas. Finally, arrange for relatively short practice sessions spread over several weeks rather than one or two long practice sessions, because distributed practice leads to better learning than massed practice. Facilitate encoding of information into long-term memory. High-quality learning rarely occurs when students adopt a relatively passive orientation. As we pointed out in Chapter 9, many students do little more than read assigned material and record ideas in verbatim form. They spend little time thinking about how ideas within topics and between topics relate to one another, or to concepts they have already learned. One reason is that many students simply do not know what else to do with information. Another reason is that teachers do little to support the kind of encoding that results in more meaningful forms of learning. Recall the study we mentioned that found that teachers in primary grades through middle school provided students with suggestions for processing information less than 10% of the time, and with explanations for the suggestions they did give less than 1% of the time. To help your students encode information for more effective storage in and retrieval from long-term memory, incorporate the following techniques into your classroom instruction. Present information through such different media as pictures, videotape, audio tape, live models, and manipulation of physical objects. Use lots of examples and analogies to foster elaboration. Prompt students to elaborate by asking them to put ideas in their own words, relate new ideas to personal experience, and create their own analogies. The nature and elements of a constructivist approach. In previous chapters, we noted that the essence of constructivist theory is that people learn best by creating their own understanding of reality. Using such characteristics as existing knowledge, attributes, values, and experiences as filters, people interpret current experience in a way that seems to make sense to them at the time. As Figure 13.2 demonstrates, by constructing two different concept maps from an identical set of concepts, knowledge can be organized in any number of ways, and the scheme one creates will reflect one's purpose or focal point. Thus, some students understand that the Jane Austen novel Sense and Sensibility is as much a satire of the paternalistic class system of the 1800s England as it is a love story, whereas other students see it only as a love story, and a boring one at that. The goal of constructivist-oriented teaching, then, is to provide a set of conditions that will lead students to construct a view of reality that both makes sense to them and addresses the essence of your objectives. A brief description of 5 of the more prominent elements that help define a constructivist-oriented classroom follows. Although 2 of these elements reflect a social constructivist orientation, bear in mind that the goal of both cognitive and social constructivism is the same: to help students become more effective thinkers and problem solvers by helping them construct richer and more meaningful schemes. A social constructivist orientation simply gives greater weight to the role of social interaction in this process. Provide scaffolded instruction within the zone of proximal development. As we said previously in the book, the zone of proximal development is the difference between what a learner can accomplish without assistance and what can be accomplished with assistance. The assistance that teachers give to students as they try to master new knowledge and skills is called scaffolding. When you try to introduce students to new material, one of the most straightforward ways to provide scaffolded instruction is by the time-honored technique of providing explanations. An analysis of research suggests 4 guidelines for creating effective instructional explanations. First, and this echoes what we said in the previous paragraph, make sure your explanations are within your student's zone of proximal development so that you make learning neither too difficult nor too easy. This guideline implies that you will need to be aware of what students know and do not know, what misconceptions they have, and what kinds of cognitive skills they possessed. Second, as we do in this textbook, make your explanations meaningful by emphasizing how concepts and principles are relevant to your students' everyday lives and to what they already know. Third, give students the opportunity to use the concepts and principles that are embedded in your explanations. Finally, because of the factors mentioned in the first guideline, some students will learn best from very direct, detailed explanations, whereas others will do best when left to figure things out for themselves. The other 2 studies that are summarized below illustrate both the nature of scaffolding and its effects on students. The first study looked at the effect of providing 3rd graders with either high or low levels of instructional support on a lesson about density and buoyancy. Why does a large iron ship float? In a high instructional support condition, the teacher sequenced the material into consecutive units, decided when certain instructional materials and objects would be available, pointed out contradictory statements made by the students, and summarized their conclusions. In the low instructional support condition, students were given a variety of materials and objects and worked in small groups to conduct experiments. The teacher's major role in the low support condition was to provide support for the process of investigation. When tested on their understanding of the concepts of density and buoyancy, both groups significantly outscored an uninstructed control group. But 1 year later, the high support group demonstrated a better grasp of these concepts than did the low support group. The second study describes the 4th grade teacher's use of various types of prompts as a form of scaffolding to help students better understand and discuss stories they had read. Some of the prompts took the form of asking for clarification. Do you mean? Can you clarify? Prompting for the use of evidence. Where in the story does it say? Praising the use of evidence. This is a good story. That is good story information. And challenging. It sounds to me as if no one's trying to look at things from the prince's point of view. These prompts not only improve the quality of the students' discussions of subsequent stories, but they cause students to prompt their classmates in the same ways. Provide opportunities for learning by discovery. By its very nature, constructivism implies the need to let students discover things for themselves. But what things? According to Jerome Bruner, whose pioneering work we mentioned in Chapter 10 on constructivist learning theory, the process of discovery should be reserved for those outcomes that allow learners to be autonomous and self-directed. These include understanding how ideas connect with one another, knowing how to analyze and frame problems, asking appropriate questions, recognizing when what we already know is relevant to what we are trying to learn, and evaluating the effectiveness of our strategies. The case we cited in Chapter 10 of the 5th grade teacher who wanted his students to understand the relationship between the circumference of a circle and its diameter is a good example of how these outcomes can be learned by guided discovery. Foster multiple viewpoints. Given the basic constructivist premise that all meaningful learning is constructed and that everyone uses a slightly different set of filters with which to build his or her view of reality, what we refer to as knowledge is actually a consensus of slightly different points of view. Thus, another element of a constructivist approach to teaching is to help students understand that different views of the same phenomena exist and that they can often be reconciled to produce a broader understanding. The technique of cooperative learning is an effective way to expose students to peers who may have different views about the right way to do something or truth of some matter and help them forge a broader understanding that is acceptable to all members of the group. In the last major section of this chapter, we describe cooperative learning in considerable detail. Can you recall completing a task, a class assignment, or reading a chapter out of a textbook that had no apparent relevance to anything that concerned you? Not very interesting or exciting, was it? Unfortunately, too many students perceive too much of schooling in that light. One constructivist remedy is to create interest and relevance by posing problems or assigning tasks that are both challenging and realistic. One basic purpose of emphasizing problems and tasks that are relevant to the lives of students is to overcome the problem of inert knowledge mentioned in Chapter 10 on constructivism. Constructivists believe that the best way to prepare students to function effectively in real-life contexts is to embed tasks in contexts that come as close as possible to those of real life. Problems can be challenging either because the correct answer is not immediately apparent or because there is no correct answer. The ill-structured problems and issues that we described previously are by their nature challenging and realistic and do not have solutions that everyone perceives as being appropriate and useful. But if you assign students an ill-structured task to investigate, pose it in such a way that they will see its relevance. For example, instead of asking high school students to debate the general pros and cons of laws that restrict personal freedoms, have them interview their community's mayor, chief of police, business owners, and peers about the pros and cons of laws that specify curfews for individuals under a certain age and that prohibit such activities as loitering and the purchase of alcohol and tobacco. Because many adolescents consider themselves mature enough to regulate their own behavior, analyzing and debating laws that are intended to restrict certain adolescent behaviors is likely to produce a fair amount of disequilibrium.